When my grandmother passed away, the house on Cedar Hill turned silent in a way I had never known. Even the wind outside seemed to move carefully, afraid to disturb what was left of her memory. My grandfather, Samuel Hart, sat for hours on the porch where she used to knit, his hands trembling slightly, his gaze fixed on the empty rocking chair beside him. I returned from the city a week after the funeral, carrying a suitcase filled more with guilt than clothes that I had promised to visit more often. I never did. Now, with her gone, there was no one left to take care of him but me. Samuel greeted me with a half-smile that never reached his eyes. His voice, once firm, had softened into something fragile. "You didn't have to come all the way, Ethan," he said. But I could tell he was relieved. The walls of that house, once warm with my grandmother's laughter, now seemed to lean inward, pressing down on him. The first few days were quiet. Too quiet. Every corner of the house whispered of her, the kitchen with her teacup still neatly lined, the garden with wilting roses, her favorite scarf folded over the arm of a chair. Samuel moved through it all like a ghost haunting his own memories. One morning, I found him standing by the dining table, setting out 2 plates for breakfast. He looked up at me, confused, as if surprised to see me there. "Your grandmother will be down soon," he said. That I didn't correct him. I just sat down and ate in silence, letting him believe for one more morning that she was still around. As the days passed, I began to notice little gaps in his memory. He forgot what day it was, where he had kept the sugar, sometimes even how long he'd been alone. But the worst part was when he forgot the smallest things about her, the color of her eyes, the song she hummed when she cooked. Each forgotten detail felt like another piece of her being erased from the world. That I started keeping a notebook, writing down the stories he once told me about their life together. I didn't want to lose what he was losing. But some days, he'd stare at the page and shake his head. "I don't remember that," he'd whisper, and I'd have to smile through the ache. A week later, a nurse arrived, a quiet man named Ryan Keller. The agency said he specialized in memory care, and from the moment he stepped into the house, I noticed the difference. His presence was calm, steady, like a breath the house had been holding finally released. That he greeted my grandfather with a warmth that didn't feel practiced. "It's good to meet you, Mr. Hart. We'll take things one day at a time." Samuel nodded absently but seemed more relaxed around him than with the neighbors or me. Maybe it was Ryan's gentle tone, or the way he moved through the house without disturbing anything, like he respected the air that still belonged to her. The 3 of us settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with tea, afternoons with soft piano music that Ryan would play from his phone. Samuel would hum along sometimes, though he couldn't remember the tune. Evenings were the hardest. That was when the loneliness crept in, and he'd ask where she was. One night, while Samuel slept, Ryan and I sat at the kitchen table. The clock ticked between us, loud in the silence. "He still talks to her sometimes," I said quietly. Ryan nodded. "That's normal. Memories don't fade all at once. They slip away in fragments, like sand through fingers." His words stayed with me. There was something in his voice, a kind of knowing that came from more than training. I wondered what stories he carried behind those calm eyes, what he'd lost to understand grief so deeply. In the days that followed, the weight of the house began to shift. It was subtle, a fresh pot of coffee in the morning, a window left open to let the sunlight in, a faint sense of life returning. Ryan had a way of bringing small things back to balance. I caught myself watching him sometimes, not out of curiosity but comfort. His quiet confidence reminded me that not everything needed fixing, some things just needed time. One evening, while the rain tapped softly on the roof, I walked into the living room and found Samuel staring at my grandmother's portrait. His lips moved silently, as if speaking to her. I stayed in the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt. Then he turned to me with tears in his eyes. "What was her name again?" he asked. The question landed like a stone in my chest. "Margaret," I said. That he repeated it slowly, like tasting something unfamiliar. "Margaret. Yes. She loved lilacs." He smiled faintly, and I smiled back, pretending not to notice the flicker of confusion behind his eyes. Later that night, I wrote the moment down in my notebook, not because I wanted to remember it, but because I was afraid of forgetting how it felt. Weeks passed. Samuel grew quieter, spending more time in his chair by the window, watching the world without really seeing it. Ryan and I continued our quiet companionship, shared meals, brief conversations that stretched longer each night. He never talked about his past, and I never asked, but sometimes, when the house felt too still, our silences felt like understanding. One morning, I woke early to find Ryan making breakfast. He looked up and smiled. "You should rest more," he said. "I can't. The house wakes me before the sun does." He chuckled softly. "Then let it rest a while longer. You've done enough for today." It was such a simple thing to say, but it loosened something in me. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe. That evening, when I set the table, I noticed there were only 2 plates, one for Samuel, one for me. Without realizing it, I had stopped setting one for her. It struck me then how quietly change happens, not in a moment of decision, but in the small habits we forget to keep. As we ate, Samuel hummed a tune I didn't recognize. His eyes were distant but peaceful. Ryan watched him with a soft smile, and in that silence, I felt something stir, not love exactly, but a warmth I hadn't felt in years. After dinner, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the house filled with that golden, fading light that makes everything look like memory. Samuel dozed off in his chair, and I stood there, listening to the steady rhythm of his breath. For the first time since she died, the house didn't feel like a monument to loss. It felt alive again, fragile, uncertain, but alive, and as I looked at Ryan across the room, I realized that maybe this was how forgetting began. Not with the absence of love, but with the arrival of something new. The air in the house was still heavy with her memory, but beneath it, something else was quietly taking root, something I wasn't sure I was ready to name. The days began blending together, soft and repetitive, like a song played too quietly to notice its melody changing. Living with Liam had started to feel natural, too natural. We moved around each other with an ease that shouldn't have belonged to 2 people who'd only met weeks ago. He'd pour me coffee before I even asked, leave a note on the counter if he came home late, and sometimes, when he laughed at something I said, it felt like the air between us shifted just slightly, as if time paused to listen. Daniel's messages grew shorter. His tone, colder. "Running late, busy at work, talk later." Each text felt like a thread snapping quietly, until the silence between us was more familiar than the sound of his voice. I stopped expecting warmth and began memorizing the patterns of Liam's presence instead, the way his hair curled when damp, the way he leaned against the counter reading the news, unaware of how easily his calm could undo me. One night, rain returned with the same insistence it had that first evening. I'd stayed late finishing a project and walked home through the downpour. By the time I reached the apartment, my clothes clung to me, heavy with water and exhaustion. Liam looked up from the couch, startled. "You're drenched," he said, standing up immediately. "Hold on." He disappeared into his room and came back with a towel and one of his hoodies, soft, faded, smelling faintly of cedar and something clean. "Here," he said, handing them to me. "You'll get sick." I hesitated before taking it. "Thanks." He smiled, half shy. "You can change in my room. I'll wait here." When I came back, his hoodie hung loose on me, sleeves too long. He tried not to laugh but failed, a quiet chuckle escaping. "It suits you," he said, and for a heartbeat, neither of us moved. He went to make tea while I sat on the couch, listening to the storm batter the windows. When he returned, he placed a cup in front of me, then sat down beside me, close enough for our shoulders to almost touch. We talked about trivial things at first, work deadlines, the neighbors' endless noise, a movie we both disliked, but the conversation kept circling back to what wasn't being said. Eventually, it broke through. "Daniel called?" Liam asked softly. I shook my head. "Not today." He nodded slowly, looking into his tea. "You don't have to answer this, but, are you happy?" The question sat between us like a confession. I wanted to say yes, to claim some kind of control over the unraveling, but the word wouldn't come. "I don't know anymore," I whispered. Liam turned slightly toward me. His voice was careful. "Sometimes not knowing is the first honest thing we admit to ourselves." There was no pity in his tone, only understanding. That made it worse. I wanted to tell him to stop being kind, to stop seeing me so clearly, but when I looked at him, all I saw was someone just as uncertain, just as tired of pretending. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating his face. He looked different in that light, not mysterious, not distant, just human. Fragile, like the rest of us. I used to think, he said quietly, that love meant staying, no matter how much it changed. But sometimes staying just means you're afraid to start over. His words lodged somewhere deep, pressing against the truth I'd been avoiding. I swallowed hard. What happened with you? He smiled faintly, without humor. I loved someone who didn't want to be seen. I kept waiting for him to look at me the way I looked at him. He never did. Something in his voice, the restraint, the ache, hit me harder than it should have. I wanted to reach out, to tell him he deserved better, but I didn't trust what my hands might do if I moved. The rain softened outside, a rhythmic whisper. Liam set his cup down, his fingers brushing the edge of mine, a small, accidental contact that didn't feel accidental. My pulse jumped. Ethan, he said quietly, his tone uncertain, almost apologetic that I met his gaze. There was no mistaking it now, the question in his eyes, the pull neither of us wanted to name. That I should have stood up. I should have said something to break it. Instead, I whispered, we shouldn't. He nodded, eyes falling to the floor. I know. But neither of us moved. The sound of the clock ticking filled the silence, a soft, merciless reminder of every second we refused to look away. My heart felt caught between guilt and gravity, one pulling me back, the other drawing me forward. I could feel the warmth of him beside me, the quiet steadiness of his breathing. It felt safe and dangerous at once. When my phone vibrated on the table, I startled. A message from Daniel, we need to talk tomorrow. I stared at the screen, the words blurring. Liam noticed, his expression unreadable. Is everything okay? I wanted to laugh at the question. Nothing about this was okay. Not Daniel's distance, not my silence, not the storm of feelings I'd let grow unchecked. It's fine, I said, voice barely holding together. Liam studied me for a moment, then stood. You should rest, he said softly, almost as if to protect me from myself. He started toward his room, then paused. Ethan, whatever happens tomorrow, be honest. With him. With yourself. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone with the hum of the rain and the echo of his words. I sat there for a long time, staring at the message on my phone. The thought of Daniel's voice, his inevitable questions, filled me with dread. But underneath that fear was something worse, the quiet realization that I'd already crossed a line Daniel didn't even know existed. That it wasn't physical, not yet. But I'd given something to Liam, a piece of my honesty, my attention, my heart's unguarded silence. I didn't know how to take it back. As the night stretched on, I replayed every moment, the laughter, the warmth, the unspoken things. I told myself it meant nothing, that I was just lonely, but deep down, I knew better. What I felt wasn't lust. It was recognition, the ache of being seen after too long in the dark. When the rain finally stopped, I stood and looked out the window. The streets were empty, slick with reflection. Somewhere behind one of those doors, Daniel was probably asleep, unaware of the distance that had already taken root, and in the room beside mine, Liam was awake. I could tell by the faint light under his door. Neither of us slept. Neither of us wanted to. Morning would come with questions I wasn't ready to answer. But for now, the night held its breath, and so did I, standing between two truths that refused to coexist. The winter came early that year, creeping through the windows before we could seal the cracks. The house, once too large for one man, now felt unbearably small. Samuel slept most of the day, his breaths shallow but steady, his mind drifting somewhere I could no longer reach. There were mornings when he looked at me as if I were a stranger who had simply wandered in. Other times, he'd call me by my father's name and ask if I'd seen the girl with the lilacs. Those moments cut deepest because I knew he meant her, my grandmother, Margaret, though her name had already slipped away from him, Ryan stayed through it all. He'd rise before dawn, checking Samuel's pulse, adjusting his medicine, brewing tea that neither of us would finish. His movements were quiet, deliberate, practiced. But I'd begun to notice small signs of exhaustion in him, the dark smudges beneath his eyes, the way he'd sometimes pause mid-sentence, as though his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. One night, after Samuel had finally drifted to sleep, I found Ryan sitting in the dim glow of the kitchen. His hands were wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. He didn't look up when I entered. Hard night? I asked softly. They're all starting to feel the same, he murmured. Then, after a pause, I cared for someone once. Before this job. He forgot me too. I sat across from him, waiting. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. Some stories hurt less when left unfinished. The silence between us felt fragile, balanced on the edge of something unspoken. I wanted to tell him how much his presence mattered, how his patience kept me from falling apart. But the words stayed trapped in my throat. Instead, I said, "You make this bearable." His eyes lifted, and for a brief, dangerous moment, we held each other's gaze. There was warmth there, recognition, maybe even longing, but we both knew what it meant. Affection born of grief is never clean. Days passed, blurring into one another. The notebook I had once filled with my grandfather's memories now lay untouched on the desk. There was nothing left to record. Samuel no longer remembered enough to share. I started writing about the present instead, about Ryan's calm voice, the way he spoke to my grandfather as if words could tether him to the world. I wrote about the small kindnesses that filled the house, a blanket folded, a fire lit, a hand briefly brushing mine when neither of us meant for it to happen. One afternoon, I found Samuel sitting in the living room, turning the pages of an empty photo album. His eyes were bright, childlike. "I think I know these people," he said with a faint smile. "Their family." I told him gently that. He nodded, satisfied with the answer, then looked at me. "You look familiar," he said. "Were you her son?" The question struck me like a cold wind. "No," I whispered. "I'm yours." He laughed softly, uncertain. "Mine?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, yours." Ryan appeared then, resting a hand on my shoulder as if to steady both of us. His touch was grounding, but it also reminded me of the fine line between care and connection. I didn't pull away. That evening, the doctor came. He spoke quietly, his words heavy but careful. The illness was progressing faster than expected. It would not be long. After he left, the house felt heavier than ever. I found myself standing outside Samuel's door, listening to the shallow rhythm of his breathing. Behind me, Ryan's footsteps approached. "He's slipping," Ryan said softly. "I know." My voice cracked. "I don't think I'm ready." "None of us ever are." I turned to him, searching his face for something, maybe reassurance, maybe blame. "You always seem so calm," I said. "How do you do it?" He hesitated. "I don't. I just pretend long enough for it to look like I can." It was an admission that broke something open in both of us. We stood in silence, neither moving, the weight of shared helplessness binding us closer than it should have. When I finally looked up, I realized how near he was. The distance between us had quietly vanished, but before anything could be said, Samuel stirred in the next room. The sound snapped us back to reality, to duty, to restraint. We both stepped away without a word. The next morning, the world was white with frost. Samuel didn't wake at his usual time. We tried gently, then urgently, until at last his eyes opened, unfocused but peaceful. He looked at me and smiled faintly. "Margaret," he whispered. That I shook my head, tears welling. "It's Ethan." He blinked slowly, confusion clouding his expression. Then, in a soft, trembling voice, he said, "You remind me of someone she loved very much." He didn't speak again after that. The following week passed in fragments, phone calls, paperwork, the kind of silence that echoes in the bones. Ryan stayed longer than he needed to, helping me pack away the photographs, the medicine bottles, the blankets that still smelled faintly of my grandfather's cologne. We spoke little, but in every small task, there was tenderness. On his last night in the house, Ryan stood by the window, staring into the fading light. He seemed peaceful at the end, he said. He was, I replied. I think he finally forgot the pain. Ryan nodded slowly. That's the mercy in it, I suppose. Forgetting can be cruel, but sometimes it's the only way to heal. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that forgetting felt like betrayal, that it left the living trapped between memory and emptiness, but I couldn't. His eyes held too much truth. When he left the next morning, the house felt unbearably quiet again. I watched his car disappear down the road until it was just another shape swallowed by the mist. For days, I wandered through the rooms, touching things as if they might still hold a pulse. Eventually, I stopped in front of my grandmother's portrait. Her smile seemed softer now, less accusing. Maybe she understood. Maybe forgiveness doesn't always need words. That I sat down and opened the notebook one last time. The first pages were filled with fragments of Samuel's stories, the middle pages held traces of Ryan, the laughter, the silences, the rain. On the last page, I wrote a single line: he forgot her face, I forgot who I was, but somewhere between the two, we both found peace. That I closed the book and left it on the windowsill, where the sunlight could touch it. The wind outside carried the faint scent of lilacs, though the garden had long gone bare. As I stepped outside, the air felt lighter. The grief was still there, but quieter now, like a song that had finally reached its last note. I didn't know where Ryan was or whether our paths would ever cross again, but I carried something of him with me, the understanding that love doesn't always need to last to mean something, and though the past had begun to fade, its echoes followed me down the hill, soft and steady, like footsteps in the snow.